Thank you, Dan, for that very nice introduction. I'm super excited to be here with all of you today. And whenever you're watching this, I hope that you will feel like at the end of our hour together that the ethical principles are something that you can utilize in your work to help you be the best school psychologist that you can be, as opposed to feeling like there's something that are put upon you as something, an onus that you have to carry. So that's my frame of reference. So I hope that will be yours by the end of our time together. School psychologists have a lot of parameters under which they do their work, as you all know. They have ethical codes that we have to attend to. They have legal requirements that we have to attend to, and not just legal requirements, but also federal laws, state laws, and then the very important local practices and procedures. And I usually ask people when I'm in person, I say, what do you think is the easiest and hardest to change of all of these things? And the easiest really is your state level statutory piece, because that is something you can go and advocate for as an individual. You probably have more access to your state people than your federal people. And you might be thinking, well, why not our local people? That's because our local policies and procedures get wound up in a whole lot of other things that are going on in our smaller communities. And it's very hard to change something that's been in place for a really long time. And sometimes the things that need to be looked at or can create some ethical dilemmas inside the school psychologist are not even written down anymore. They are the how we do it, as I like to call them. And those are the most resistant to change of all. So hopefully we can talk through an example that will help you think about the issues to consider when you come up against one of those local policies or procedures, how that interfaces with state and federal law, and how all of that fits within our ethical standards. So hopefully that's what we'll do. When the ethical responsibility comes into conflict with another ethical responsibility or some other regulatory standard, then the school psychologist experiences an ethical dilemma. And this is really important.
And then the last thing we're going to do with our last 15 minutes is what is consultation? And the reason why I put this in at the end is because I feel like it's really important, and it's an often overlooked part of functional behavior assessment. So consultation is an indirect model of delivering educational and mental health services. And this is what we do when we do a functional behavior assessment. And there's so many pieces to consultation that are important with a functional behavior assessment. Remember when I said earlier, most of the time, it's not the intervention that is the problem. It's not even the assessment or the function that is the problem. It's literally that something wasn't implemented with fidelity or as long as it should be. And usually the reason that is relies totally on consultation and consultation practices. So additional aspects of consultation, this is where we get into, you work with adults to impact the lives of kids. So it's triadic in nature. The assumptions, there's an optimal working relationship between the consultant and the consultee. So it's non-hierarchical. And that's what a lot of you guys are going to be doing when you're doing FBAs. It is going to be non-hierarchical. You focus on consultee work-related problems rather than personal problems. Personal responsibility for client welfare by the consultee, and the client has the freedom to reject consultant guidance, and communication is confidential. So skill areas for consultants and collaborators: interpersonal skills, communication skills, problem-solving skills, and skills in working with organizations. So what I just want to kind of leave you guys with is, when you design your FBA, these kind of consulting skills to get somebody to actually go through what it is you want them to go through is huge. So putting the consultee at ease, setting expectations about the relationship, creating an environment of mutual collaboration, creating an environment conducive to change, developing social influence by being trustworthy, noting and responding to verbalizations, and being respectful. So having those kind of interpersonal skills, the most important thing about your FBA when you're working with another adult to help their child or to help somebody in their classroom is to establish that relationship with them so that they trust you and that they're more likely to implement what it is you're asking them to implement. Communication skills, attending to them non-verbally, listening, expressing empathy, questioning. We don't want to go in there and act as if we know everything, because we don't. Clarifying or paraphrasing, summarizing what they said, providing feedback, giving information. Speak the same language. In applied behavior analysis, we love our behavior speak, but our behavior speak can be a barrier. I don't want to go into my doctor and have him speak in these terms that I don't understand. So being able to speak the same language and really use those communication skills. Problem solving skills. Set the stage for problem solving. Let them know exactly what you're going to do. I'm going to ask you questions. I'm going to collect data in your classroom. I might come into your home. Is that okay? Are there certain rules that you want me to follow? Define the problem with them. Examine that environment. Gather and analyze and interpret the data. Design the interventions with them. Remember, this is collaboration. You're doing it with them. You're going to ask another adult to implement the strategies that you want them to implement. So you want them to do it together. You want to do it, you want this to be a collaborative process. And then predict what will occur. So what we know is that challenging behaviors can typically serve many purposes and require many interventions. A student may tantrum to get attention before lunch, academics, preferred food. It's not always clean, which is why we always have to do our due diligence to figure it out. And we need to have different strategies. So some common function-based interventions, because I know everybody is like, well, what can we do? So for escape-motivated behavior, provide choices in schedule and activities. You know, you can say, do you want to do this first or this first, in order to have a child feel a little bit more agency. Make undesired tasks more pleasurable. I feel like this is something I say often. I don't know why sometimes in schools we've just decided that, or even in work, that some people, this is just life. We have to do things we don't want to do. That's just what we do. I don't know why that is. I think we can make things more fun. Sometimes this is something I deal with when I hear people say, okay, now it's time to work. And I'm like, do we even need to use work? I mean, can't we just kind of make it sound like it's more fun? Increasing predictability. So what we know is predictability and lack of predictability breeds anxiety. So when kids, adults, everybody feels like there's predictability in their schedule, they're more likely to have less anxiety and kind of go through the routine. So visual schedules, social stories, intersperse easy and preferred versus non-preferred tasks. This would probably work for many of you guys too. If you kind of intersperse and get some behavioral momentum with your easy tasks and then go to your non-preferred. I'm kind of the opposite. I like to start with the non-preferred and then go to the easy preferred, but whatever works, but interspersing them so that the whole day is not just a non-preferred task. Modify curriculum and or instructional practices, and behavioral momentum. So prompting 3, 4 easy preferreds, and then prompting something that's more likely to be associated with noncompliance. For attention-seeking behavior, non-contingent attention or fixed schedule for attention. So really, sometimes I will describe this as, if you think of kids in a fish tank and water is attention, they don't care if it's clean water or dirty water. They just care that their fish tank is full. So if you can make a point to fill the fish tank with clean water, they're less likely to engage in behaviors to get that dirty water, which might be your correction or being punished or having to go to the office. Frequent opportunities for student recognition and praise. The positive interaction of 4-to-1. When I go into schools, and if I have to do direct observation, I will do, just because out of curiosity, I will do data collection on the 4-to-1 to see kind of where we are with that. And if it's a pure 4-to-1 or what we're working with. And teachers usually are really open to saying like, oh, yeah, this is great. Thank you. I mean, I didn't even realize I was correcting as much as I was correcting. So this was helpful. And provide opportunities for peer interaction. So if you have someone who's attention seeking, maybe they're more likely to work with peers. I am. If I have like a task that I really don't want to do, I will sit in a colleague's office with my laptop and say like, hey, can you just kind of walk through this with me? It helps. So some people are maintained by that, myself included. And increase teacher and staff proximity to the student. To obtain a desired item or activity, increase accessibility. So having that item more often, again, it's the whole clean water, dirty water, fish tank thing. You're less likely to engage in that behavior if it's available. Increase predictability for desired item or activity. So a picture schedule. First you do this, then you do that.
So test anxiety, I think we all know, is a prominent issue today. I think sometimes the New Yorker is a good index of what's become a kind of cultural issue, where you can see a child approaching their parents saying, I dreamed I was being chased by a giant standardized test. And so I think it's just emblematic of our times. Sometimes I think of this as being a kind of increase over time. At the very least, there's an increase in our discussions around test anxiety. And I'd like to talk about a few factors that I think may be at play. One of them I refer to as the test anxiety industry. There are parties who are not trying deliberately to make children or students anxious, but the nature of their work might lead to that incidentally. And so sometimes I see test preparation materials, for instance, that emphasize just how important it is to get as high a score as possible. Maybe it's also my New York City-based perspective, but I see some test prep folks like tutors who also are unintentionally kind of communicating that it's so important to get the highest score you can. What matters in life is getting a perfect score on the SAT and things like that. So again, these folks aren't necessarily trying to do any harm, certainly, but even so, they can be causes of increased test anxiety in some of the students who I've worked with. Another factor that I think is important, we see ever-increasing competition in high-achieving settings. And this will probably apply to some folks in the audience more than others in terms of who you work with. But if you're working with students who are in a high-achieving school or high-achieving classes, or just a high-achieving area, a kind of high-performance area, we see very high levels of test anxiety. And I'll come back to this slide, but I just want to show us a little bit more detail about this. There was a psychologist, Sunia Luthar, she sadly passed away a few years ago. She had been at Teachers College here. And so she had done some work that started about 20, 30 years ago. She was actually doing work on high-risk youth And she wanted to have a control group. And so her control group was a kind of what she thought would be low risk, affluent youth. And she was surprised to find that the affluent youth actually had higher rates of anxiety, depression, and substance abuse than the so-called at-risk youth. And so she spent the rest of her career documenting about how these sort of affluent folks, people who were in high achieving areas, often had unique and serious mental health problems. And so one of the aspects of that is academic competition. Shortly before she passed away, this article was published in American Psychologist, the APA flagship journal, on high achieving schools being a risk factor for mental health problems. I won't go into this in great detail, and I'll just actually show briefly the complicated model that she and her colleagues developed. I know this is small text, but some readers may want to look more into it. But it describes a bunch of different processes that make students in high achieving settings more vulnerable to mental health problems. And a lot of this relates to test anxiety, feeling as though you're in tremendous competition with students who are sitting next to you in class, what she and her colleagues call the survival of the fittest mentality. Only so many students in that class are able to get into a top college and so forth. Feeling as though your self-worth is dependent on very particular accomplishments that you may or may not be able to meet. These sorts of things. So I definitely see these processes in my own clinical work as one of the things that's led to an increase in test anxiety in some populations. The final factor is a sort of general rise in anxiety and other related mental health problems, particularly in youth. So we've seen a lot of work on this in the past several years, starting with the pandemic, but even as the COVID-19 pandemic receded, we've seen continued problems in areas like anxiety. A related topic that I'll talk a bit about that some psychologists have speculated about is that social media, other sorts of technology factors may be playing a role in the rise of these problems. So I'll just mention a few things that some folks in the audience may be familiar with, like for instance, surveys that started soon after the pandemic started to recede, showing that very high rates of teens and young adults were reporting significant mental health problems. In one survey in 2021-2022, 1/5 of teens reported clinically significant anxiety on a brief screener, the GAD-2, a sort of brief generalized anxiety screener. Some folks may also be familiar with Jonathan Haidt, the psychologist at NYU. He published a book last year that's gotten a lot of press, The Anxious Generation. And so Haidt argues there are a couple of different factors that are leading to a rise in anxiety. One is a kind of social media and other sorts of technology factors. Another is kind of overprotection from natural environment. Regardless of the particular causes, though, Haidt and his colleagues have done a great job documenting just the rise in anxiety. And just to show you a graph from their materials, their work has shown that this started long before the pandemic. So if we look at the cohort that often we're working with, teens, young adults, we see a tremendous rise in anxiety. We see a small rise in anxiety in somewhat older folks, ages 26 to 34. And then for people older than that, we don't really see much change, but really huge increase that started around 2012 for young adults. Let's see. So these are, again, a few factors that I think we need to consider when folks ask me, why is test anxiety so prevalent? When teachers say to me, I don't remember all of these problems 10 or 20 years ago. We really can note a few factors that might have caused that. The general philosophy of these test anxiety workshops and this intervention generally, Dr. Jordan and I took this from acceptance-based behavior therapy ideas. We naturally kind of go to those for a lot of our clinical work. So I just want to talk a little bit about this philosophy. Some folks in the audience may have a great deal of training, and you'll know this is a bit of a sort of simple description. But the idea behind acceptance-based therapy for anxiety is that anxiety itself is not inherently bad. It's, of course, part of the human condition, but it can be annoying, and at times it can be maladaptive if we let it. Usually what causes more problems than the anxiety itself is our reactions to the anxiety. So sometimes when we feel anxious feelings, or if we're thinking anxious thoughts like worries, we judge ourselves, and that causes a kind of secondary negative emotion. We're feeling negative emotions about our negative emotions. Another thing that can be a bad reaction is trusting that our thoughts and feelings are necessarily true and accurate. All kinds of random thoughts and feelings occur to us throughout the day. Often they're irrational. Often they need to be discarded. If a child has the sort of random thought during an exam that their parents are going to disown them or throw them out of the house for failing a test or something like that, That's not necessarily rational. It probably is not rational. If they think they're going to fail a class because they don't do well on a test, even that's very unusual. So students need to recognize when their thoughts are not necessarily accurate and not treat them that way. And then finally, the big thing, the big bad reaction to anxiety is what we call experiential avoidance, trying to do anything possible to avoid experiencing that anxiety. And so that's what leads to things like school refusal behavior and, in a milder form, procrastinating on studying. So again, we're trying to manage the reactions to the anxiety, and those are things that we can learn to control. We may not be able to stop anxiety from happening. We're unlikely to be able to stop it entirely, but we can change the way we respond to it. Another element of the philosophy is that anxiety can be managed, but even when the anxiety is there, we can still move towards our goals. We have control over a lot of our behavior. And we want to kind of emphasize to students what your goals are, and then that you can still do things like test yourself. When you're feeling anxious before an exam, you can still engage in appropriate studying behavior. So before I talk about the specific techniques that come from this general philosophy, I'll note that none of these were sort of developed whole cloth by us. All of these were developed, some of them several decades ago, as established, empirically supported techniques for anxiety. So to take an example, behavioral relaxation training has been common since the 60s and 70s. Arguably, the ideas actually go back several decades earlier, but we work to try to apply these specifically to test anxiety and package them in modules that, again, can be adjusted depending on the particular students we're working with. So with that as an introduction, I'll spend some time going through those 5 modules and discussing the specifics of the procedures.
We're just trying to help them through this process. So there are a lot of signs and symptoms of anxiety. And, often when I present this workshop specifically to parents about, kind of what they can do, I say anxiety can look really different in kids. Like every kid might present it in a certain way. So I mentioned earlier, a lot of times it's this quiet issue, right? We don't see it. Maybe that kids aren't necessarily talking about it. We're not seeing them, have anger outbursts. But sometimes it can. And for some kids, we may see behavioral manifestations that we think maybe they're becoming oppositional or they have anger problems. But instead, these things are really driven by underlying anxiety. And it's part of why we as clinicians need to really spend time with families and with kids to conceptualize what the underlying factors are that might be impacting kids regarding their anxiety. So we can see things like anger outbursts or crying, parents saying, there's meltdowns. There's this theory or this kind of concept of after school restraint collapse. So, sounds really kind of a fancy word, but we've all heard, about kids who the school doesn't know they're anxious at all, right? In school, we hear they're doing fine. But what happens is that restraint of trying to manage and regulate that anxiety, maybe not always in healthy ways, results in this period of kind of that kind of coming down after they get home. And we might see more emotionality or dysregulation when kids are home. And, so we'll hear from parents saying, gosh, they're so stressed when they get home. And then we may talk to teachers and go, oh, they're this wonderful kid all day. So, we also hear terms like camouflaging and masking, and all of these things are kind of go together in some ways with when we talk about this kind of after school collapse. So we have to know and really look across settings. And just because maybe a kid is able to hold it together at school all day, that it doesn't have an impact later. And it's this balance. It's great that they're doing well in school, but it's also not a healthy way to manage long term. And we may see more difficulties down the line. So, those that are working in schools, I'll often say we have to listen to what that looks like at home. And are there some supports that we can do during the school day that might lessen that later, whether that be maybe some frequent breaks or maybe some ways to kind of do some decompression, kind of stress relief activities through the day, it might not be this complex intervention. I've had kids who have that aspect, that symptom afterwards, that kind of fatigue at the end of the day. And sometimes, throughout the day, doing 2 to 5 minute little breaks with very specific anxiety reduction strategies, whether that be some type of a mindfulness or engaging in deep breathing, maybe even just taking a walk, might be enough to decrease that when kids get home. So when we talk about anxiety, why do we want to tackle anxiety in kids in general? So why do we kind of want to address this? A few things. One is, doing this for years, and many of you probably know this as well, the anxiety is kind of a quiet distress, right? Many kids, they may not say that they're anxious. Maybe they're just withdrawn. Maybe we may say they're shy or whatever term we might put to it, but it's sometimes quiet. It's not always that we see these behaviors that are kind of external. And we're going to talk about some of those. But for a lot of kids, it's not that they're showing behaviors that may be more challenging or disturbing behaviors. It may be something that's much more internal. We also want to tackle this because problematic anxiety doesn't just go away. I oftentimes will say, oh, they're going to grow out of it. Well, maybe there are cases, but what we see more often is kids who have anxiety, depending on kind of the behaviors and other things that come into play, the anxiety actually doesn't go away over time. And sometimes we'll see that reinforcing some of that anxiety actually increases the anxiety. So a lot of times working with parents just developmentally that, the earlier we intervene, before maybe the anxiety is at a high level, the more successful generally will be in our interventions. The other thing is that, anxiety in kids is associated with adult anxiety later. So we know that if we're not treating anxiety at a young age, we may see even in adulthood anxiety or even depression develop. So the earlier we intervene, of course, the better. And then anxiety in kids is associated with substance use and substance abuse in adulthood. So, again, why does that happen? Well, there's a lot of thoughts around it, but I think kind of the simple idea is that many times we see that when we're not intervening with anxiety and building coping strategies, individuals will find other ways to cope. So maybe in adolescence, they're exposed or experimenting with alcohol, and all of a sudden their anxiety feels better. We've all heard of people who say, oh, when I drink, I'm not, I'm a much more social person. For some people, that becomes reinforcing, and that can engage us into kind of a pattern of behavior. And again, not with everybody that has anxiety, but it is a risk factor that we have to consider. So we want to tackle anxiety early in kids, not only to help with quality of life at a young age, but also from a preventative factor, that making sure that we're not seeing these things worsen over time or develop into other difficulties. So, do we want to remove all anxiety from kids? So we, a lot of times when we talk about anxiety, we talk about it in this negative tone, and anxiety isn't necessarily itself bad. In fact, for some of us, it can be very motivating. So, the simple answer is no. We don't want to remove all anxiety from kids. We don't want them to just take risks in everything, but we want to make it more manageable, and we want to make it where they can be thoughtful in how they approach certain situations. So with anxiety, we're looking to maybe lessen the distress from it. We're looking to build coping around how we handle or manage that anxiety, but we're not going to eliminate it completely. We want healthy anxiety to be part of people's lives. It is protective. We don't do certain dangerous behaviors because anxiety may help us. Anxiety may help us be motivated, right? We may, worry that we're, not going to get a good job, and we may work harder in school as kind of an example. So when we work with parents, again, our goal is we're not taking away all the stress. We're just trying to help them through and your child doesn't have to have an anxiety disorder, of course, to do these. They're just good wellness kind of strategies. So get moving. Having kids make sure they're doing, moderate exercise every day. They don't have to go to the gym, but they need to do some movement. Maybe, minimizing some of that time that is in media and device use and that space, and really trying to get more into doing some activities. And as parents, encouraging that to occur together, whether maybe they could take a hike together or just go outside and pass ball or jump rope or do whatever they want, but some physical activity. Diets. Again, we know that that's part of wellness in general. Not that we have to do these big elimination things, but we do know that, maybe limiting some sugar and caffeine for kids who are more prone to anxiety can help. Again, doesn't mean we have to eliminate anything, but just paying attention to those aspects. One thing I wish I could spend a whole lot more time on today, but when you're working with parents, ensuring that we do talk about sleep. And again, earlier I mentioned that book, Banishing Bedtime Battles, as a resource for you all working with families that you can share with them. But really paying attention to how sleep is impacted, and then how that might impact things like anxiety. Think of yourselves, right? Like, we've all had times where we didn't get a good night's sleep. What's our tolerance that next day? What's our ability to manage our own emotions and those types of factors? And so we need to kind of pay attention to that. These lifestyle pieces are sometimes overlooked, but can be really important. Getting families into practicing some relaxation or mindfulness. I often encourage parents to maybe do some pause on purpose activities through the day, that, randomly through the day, just saying, all right, pause on purpose, set a timer for 5 minutes, and everybody in the family puts down what they're doing, and maybe they just take a few deep breaths. Maybe they do a progressive muscle relaxation. And there's a whole bunch of activities, but building into our day reset times that we can focus on, not just at times when we're reacting to anxiety. Good wellness and good anxiety management is about doing it habitually, right? Being part of it.
If we are working, one thing that makes school psychologists different is that we are trained to work within a system as a part of that system. And so to collaborate with our colleagues and respect them and understand where they're coming from is an inherent part of the way that we work. Our work is not only sitting with a student and administering a technique and then going away and telling someone, and summarizing that for someone else to use that information. It's also working with those colleagues to ensure that all of us together in their educational milieu of the student are creating something that is hoping for the best outcome that the student can hope for, if you will. So that is a difference between school psychologists and technicians who come in and do the work. And there you have it. It's very much part of our ethical responsibilities. The priority of child welfare pretty much is a standard that is relevant to almost any ethical dilemma, because we need to remember as school psychologists, and it helps us to read and reflect, that standard 3.2.3 says that we not just believe, but communicate to others that our commitment to protecting the rights and welfare of children and youth is our highest priority. And so it's not our only priority. We acknowledge that it's maybe not everyone's highest priority, but it is our highest priority. And that doesn't matter if it's something that feels routine, mundane, doesn't matter. It is always. And we communicate that to our colleagues, even when it's not easy to communicate that. But also, remember when I said about the opportunity? That is an opportunity to open the door. Probably you've talked about working in meetings that are challenging and people are not in agreement how to move forward and people emotions are getting high. And one thing that is always a recommendation for such sort of highly charged meetings is to refocus back on the child. That is what this is about. If we see a situation, a procedure, an implicit or explicit procedure that doesn't feel like it's in the best interest of an individual student or individual students overall, then we can use this ethical responsibility to advocate for at least examining the system to see if we can come up with something that is more in line with the interests and rights of an individual student or individual students sequentially. And then finally, also in that vein, standard 4.1.2 is that when school psychologists observe situations that may not be in the best interest or of reasonable benefit for students and families, then it's our ethical responsibility to promote change. Do we have to do the change? Not always. Sometimes it's in our purview, but promoting change is difficult than actually not implementing. What's the word I want? Advocating for change and promoting change is not the same thing as saying, okay, I'll write a new procedure. That's something that would need to be more collaborative.
So what we did in my former district was we vetted 3 professionals in our community that had expertise in threatening, targeted violence. They also had expertise in threat assessment. They understood disabilities and they understood schools. Okay. Now, it is not easy to find those professionals, but now that there are interstate compacts, there are professionals sometimes in other states that have the ability to help us with this. And we said, if you pick off this list of 3 and you sign the release of information for us to partner with them to better help address your child's needs, we will pay for it. Okay. Now, granted, it takes your superintendent being willing to, to disperse some funds, but we found that approach helped really well because this was only used in real serious cases. But then we had another partner to help us figure out what is the best way to address the concerns and get the right services in place. And in this particular case, it says the IEP team should be sharing information with the threat assessment team and vice versa, because the threat assessment team needs to understand the disability, present levels of functioning, the current plan in place, in order to make sure that they're interpreting the behaviors correctly and recommending appropriate supports. And in addition, I sometimes see schools, we're going to suspend the student while we do the threat assessment. First of all, not best practices. I don't know how you do a good threat assessment when the student is away from school, which, by the way, increases risk, as I mentioned earlier. And if they are a student with a disability, if you are removing them from school while doing a threat assessment, that could be considered a change in placement, and parent consent could be needed and/or an MDR required. So how do we keep out of the tricky waters? Keep them at school under supervision, okay, as we're engaging them in this process, and the outcomes of the threat assessment determine if removal is even going to be necessary and appropriate. In this particular case, we did have a student with a disability who threatened to poison a classmate with hand sanitizer. This was back when they still referred to the disability as Asperger's. They removed the student from their magnet school. And when it went in front of a hearing officer, they said no. You failed to have the evidence to show that they actually intended to do that. Okay. You failed to show that there was a high probability that they were going to do it. And you didn't have any data to say what you had in place proactively to address some of the concerns that led to the student threatening that classmate. So again, direct threat standard. Okay. So they said, no, you are not allowed to remove the student. Now, in this particular case, this was an 8th grader with ADHD who had an outside psychiatric evaluation done. Okay. And it was the psychiatrist that actually labeled the student as dangerously violent. Okay. The student is going to be coming back to school. Okay. So they were putting their educational programming in place. And the school said, we need one-on-one monitoring and daily searches. The parents tried to fight that, saying that it was too much. And the courts supported the school district because they said, no, data supports one-on-one monitoring and daily searches are appropriate. And this was the one where they also said, and the results of this threat assessment need to be shared with the IEP team, okay, for the purpose of appropriate educational programming. So again, that collaboration back and forth where one process informs. Now, in regards to FERPA, FERPA we know is the law that covers the confidentiality of educational records. However, we can share information from educational records without consent when it is necessary to protect the health and safety of a student or other individual, if there is a significant and articulable threat. This also means special education documentation or 504 paperwork. We are not violating FERPA when we share information from IEP records or 504 records with the threat assessment team. There's actually court cases that say we better be sharing information back and forth because that disability needs to be taken into consideration in the threat assessment. Now, it does not mean a blanket release of all educational records. 2 members of the threat assessment team, we can only share information that is specifically related to that safety concern. So what that means is someone on the threat assessment team, particularly your special education representative or the school psychologist, would be looking over the IEP, the 504 paperwork, and then determining what is pertinent to the threat assessment team to know in order to understand the dynamics of the behavior. Okay, do they actually pose a threat or not? And most importantly, what might we need to do for programming? Because we've got to know what's currently in place, baseline behaviors, present levels of functioning, current programming, then to determine, is this behavior inconsistent with baseline behavior? And or what do we already have in place to try to address it? Is it sufficient or not? So again, that information when we have a serious safety concern, we are not violating FERPA. But again, it is recommended that your threat assessment team members do sign an acknowledgement of confidentiality, so they are not out there talking to individuals that they should not be talking to. If we end up with a student who, for example, ends up in the juvenile justice system, there may be appropriate times where we do need to share information with that juvenile justice system in order to inform potentially if they're going to be charged. But most importantly, do we have information that can help inform what is the best interventions and supports for that particular individual? If you get a court order or a subpoena, you always want to double check with your educational attorney because they will guide us through what do we need to share. And we can share information with other schools. We are not violating FERPA if we have a good rationale why sharing that information is important in order to address the safety concerns. So I will talk more about that as I get into some additional information sharing and the exchange of records. Now, FERPA does allow us to share to put information in the student's records if that significant behavior posed a risk to safety and disciplinary action was taken. It does not say we must keep it in the threat assessment records, but if the threat assessment resulted in disciplinary action and there was a significant safety concern, we can place that threat assessment, for example, within their cumulative records that would then get forwarded. But I will tell you, really, the goal of this is to not have to do discipline. We really want to be looking at alternatives to discipline. Also, we can disclose information to staff who have a legitimate educational interest. Basically, anybody who is providing services to that student, who's going to be supervising that student, or is going to be responsible for supervision during different points of the day. Or, for example, if you have an outside expert that you are wanting to bring in, as long as you have identified them as school officials within your FERPA notification, you can share information from educational records for the purpose of those individuals doing their job and being able to figure out how to best support the student. Now, in regards to MDRs, okay, manifestation determination reviews, we do not have to do an MDR every single time we do a threat assessment. We only need to do an MDR on a student with a disability if we meet the MDR threshold as we would in any other situation. So in other words, if that removal, okay, or that disciplinary action is going to be for more than 10 consecutive school days, or it adds up to more than 10 days, then yes, we would need to do a manifestation determination review, okay? Also, we do not have to do a threat assessment every single time a student with a disability is dysregulated, okay? So in the screening tool that we teach as part of the Secret Service NTAC model, one of the biggest questions in there is this consistent with baseline behavior? Are we currently addressing this behavior? If so, we do not have to go to a full threat assessment every single time the student is dysregulated. However, if we are going to look to remove that student from campus or restrict participation, and it's going to meet the magical 10-day rule, we do need to conduct a threat assessment because we got to determine, do they actually pose a threat? And that is going to then also activate an MDR, okay? So there's also some information out there that a threat assessment protects students from being removed. No, it's not a protection, okay? Because we're looking at the behaviors of concern. Again, it's not about the label, right? The threat assessment, though, helps determine, do they actually pose a threat to meet the direct threat standard? And is removal even appropriate? Or is this something that we could better handle through other programming or like conflict resolution, problem solving, or restorative practice? So again, we do not want to confuse threat assessment with MDRs. We do not want to confuse manifestation determination reviews with threat assessments. They have their own separate protocols that need to be followed, but information may be shared back and forth, okay? So again, if that threat assessment determines we need to do removal and it's going to be more than the 10 days or cumulative 10 days, then we may also find ourselves in an MDR. But also the outcome of the MDR can help inform what do we need to do for management and programming. So if they are on an IEP, okay, and we need to remove them from school because of potential threatening behavior, you technically need to have an MDR within 10 days of that decision to change placement, okay? If you determine it's not a manifestation, then as appropriate, okay, we need to look at doing an FBA, a behavior intervention plan, and more than likely removal is not going to be supported if it is not, well, I should take that back. If it's not a manifestation of their behavior, then we can potentially proceed with disciplinary action as we would with any other student. But what they're also going to say is, could you do an FBA and develop a BIP that might be more appropriate than looking at significant disciplinary action? If it is a manifestation of their disability, you are not more than likely going to be able to look at discipline and or removal. And do we need to do an FBA and a BIP? Or if they already have one in place, do we need to go back and update that? Okay. Now, here's something most people don't realize is if they are currently on a 504 and we end up doing a threat assessment, okay, we determine they do pose a potential significant risk. And we are going to be looking at any significant change of placement, or especially if we're looking at proceeding with expulsion. Technically speaking, you need to conduct an evaluation prior. And that's where the stay put rule may come into play. Why they have that in there is rather than expelling them from school or placing them in a more restrictive alternative setting, might they qualify for services that could be addressed through an IEP and a least restrictive environment?
Parameters that we have to consider as school psychologists. There are ethical codes, there are ethical codes for school psychologists, ethical codes, broader ethical codes for APA. Some of you may be from other countries, so we have international codes. And all of those things are very consistent if you look at them across the various organizations. What sometimes comes a little different is if you look at ethics codes for other professionals that we sometimes collaborate with. And while some of the general guiding principles, the sort of do no harm and take care of those under your charge are similar, there are some things that are quite specific to other professionals. So we sometimes get so caught up in our own ethical codes that we forget that the people we're working with also have their own set of ethical codes that they're considering when they're working with kids, students, families, whatever. We also have myriad legal requirements. It's really interesting because if you look at school psychologists or the practice of psychology in schools, there are so many requirements and restrictions and instructions about what we do, what we can do, what we shouldn't do, what we can't do, those kinds of things. And it's constantly changing. So we have to make it our responsibility to go ahead and keep up on all of those things at any given time so that we know that not only are we practicing in line with our ethical standards, but also the legal requirements. Obviously, there are federal requirements, FERPA, IDEA, regular ed law, ESSA. Then we also have state level interpretations of those federal requirements. We also have credentialing requirements or licensing requirements, depending on the state. And then we have state statutory regulations that may or may not be consistent with federal ones, and it just can get overwhelming sometimes. Sometimes we feel completely constrained by all of these things. And if that's not enough, we have local policies and procedures, which are really challenging at times if we bump up against local policies or procedures, more so procedures, because systems get very attached to the way they do things. And so to make adjustments within a system, when a system has been doing something the same way for a really long time, can be quite challenging. And so sometimes using our ethical standards as, I don't want to say justification, because that sounds like we're like trying to convince someone of something that's not really, but as the reason why we advocate for certain things. There have been times over the course of my career that I have been asked by a teacher, by an administrator, to have a conversation with a parent to get them to agree to something because I was the one who had the most, what's the word I want to use? Well, the most well-developed relationship with the parent. And basically asking me to deploy a social psychology influence technique to get the parent to agree to something that they had been avoiding in the past. And I mean, before I started looking into this and studying how this could affect my professional decisions about what I do and don't do, I might have done it, especially if my belief was that what we were asking the parent to agree to is in the best interest of the child. But what I hope I would do now, if faced with such a situation, is that I would reflect on that, and I would, if I chose to speak with the parent or talk with the parent, that I would put those influence there and try to remove the power of that dynamic of foot in the door and say, I know that we have a good working relationship, and I know that this is a very difficult decision, and I'm here to inform, let you ask questions, and any way I can support you in making your decision, but at the end of the day, it's your decision. That is a very different way than most people talk to parents in schools in my experience. If you're fortunate enough to live in a system that supports that kind of relationship with parents, then I applaud you. And I applaud you that you probably had something to do with creating it. And I think I don't, well, this is kind of like, we've seen some backlash from parents group who have pushed back and said, hey, I didn't give permission for that. I didn't ask for that. I didn't, that kind of thing. And this might be coming from a long history of trying to persuade parents to do things rather than giving them information and letting them make their own choices. And so thinking about that as a well-documented, legitimate type of influence that can be deployed to get someone to do something is something that we need to think about as school professionals and as school psychologists specifically. So when thinking about standard 2.3.1, considerations prior to disability determination, I really wanted to take a deep dive into this because I think, not just I think, my experience anecdotally in being a part of many of these conversations over the years is that some of the conversations that we have about what to do and why are you doing that and you should never do this and you should never do that and you should use these tables and not those completely have skipped over the before parts of, are we in the context of special education eligibility attending to the rule out factors or the factors that have to be considered prior to consideration for eligibility with the same rigor and with the same passion that we are considering the assessment data, whatever form it might take, that we collect ourselves. And obviously, since I've done a deep dive into this, I think that we are not looking at some of the exclusionary factors in the same way that we look at our specific data. And you might say, well, that's because it doesn't involve us. That's someone else. Someone else is taking care of that part. Fair enough. But we are taking part in determining the eligibility, and we are crafting our assessment contents based on some of this information, especially when it comes to looking at eligibility under the category of specific learning disability and the category of serious emotional disturbance, emotional disability, emotional behavioral disability, whatever you are calling it in your particular location. The rest of this time is going to focus on the specific learning disability piece, but I'll probably bring in and mention how that would be relevant in the context of looking at behavioral interventions and considerations prior to approaching the notion of a behavioral disability that requires special education and related services. So here is the IDEA statute that says what is our special rule for eligibility determination, that it can't, that when we determine eligibility, we are saying that the child does not present with the educational functioning based on these three criteria to start with. We're going to get to the other ones in a minute. Don't let me lose you. This can't be the reason or the primary reason for the observed difficulty the child is having in school. Lack of appropriate instruction in reading, lack of instruction in math, or limited English proficiency. So in other words, we cannot determine that a child is a child with a disability if we don't have the data to support that these things are not the reason, which sounds like proving a negative, which is very hard to do, which is the point of why they even spend time talking about this, because it is hard to do. So let's look and see how our ethics can help us. Oh, look, it says the same exact thing in our ethical standards. This is a nice example of how our ethics and the law are consistent instead of divergent, which happens at times as well, which can be quite frustrating to some people, including myself. And then if we look at, well, what does that mean in a specific kind of way? We have ethical standards related to intervention and instructional strategies. Now, does this mean that we are providing said interventions and instructional strategies? Probably not. There are other professionals out there that I mentioned, like teachers, other mental health professionals, behavioral specialists, any number of other professionals who have their own set of standards and ethical obligations that may be providing this service. But if we are incorporating that into our obligation of considering all of these things before a disability label as regards to special education, then we have to be able to interpret the accuracy of the information that we're given.
The last two pieces that I really want to touch on before we kind of transition to really the core essence of the REACH model is really this idea of creating safe space and being open to feedback. I think those two bullet points are really work in tandem. So when I mean about creating a safe space, I think about, and I was, the importance of the sense that disclosure about racial and cultural stress is a privilege, that, hearing about somebody's story is a privilege. It's not a right. We don't have a guarantee to hear that. And I think sometimes when we're in the rhythm of our checklists or our assessments or the things that we feel like we have to do to be kind of good clinicians, we don't always kind of empower the voices of our clients to tell us their story in their time and their level of detail. And so being thoughtful about, while you get this information today and you're very gung-ho and you're very emboldened to go out and kind of really implement all of this, always keeping the person first and being thoughtful about, their consent to be able to and willingness to participate in these discussions with you. Also, at the same time, you may implement everything that we talk about today and go and do it with such genuine interest and finesse and follow everything to the T that maybe I suggest and maybe other resources suggest, and you may still miss the mark. I've been called out by, individuals who look like me, who are different than me, from similar backgrounds, different backgrounds, in terms of how this model does or does not work for them. And, one of the things I have to do is be open to their feedback in terms of the pieces that are, really important for me to listen to, things that I need to affirm, and also, and minimize my defensiveness and my dismissiveness of that by nature of just like, if it doesn't sound right. And so that was another piece that, I typically create more time to talk about, but I wanted to make sure that even though you're going to receive a lot of tips today, make sure that you're kind of being mindful of like the when you're bringing it up, getting consent that they're okay with you bringing it up, and also being receptive to, even if you bring it up and you follow all the tips, they may still give you feedback either verbally or non-verbally that suggests that there's still some finesse, there's still some learning that needs to happen, and that's okay. Okay. So the last component of building a culturally responsive mindset that I will want to allude to that is a nice segue to where we're about to get to in terms of the reach model is really thinking about whenever we are trying to show up for our clients in a way that celebrates their strengths, creates space for the stresses that they're going through, that we don't just have to do what feels natural or respond from our gut, right? We can actually utilize like a lot of research, a lot of theory, a lot of frameworks that are available to us to kind of really anchor and be theory driven with clear intent of how we're trying to show up. And so today's training really is about helping to offer just yet another framework that will help you to be, thoughtful about getting the information about cultural stress and also being flexible about how you respond. So if they shared something and you're not quite sure if there's a cultural flavor to this, one of the follow-up questions, or these are some prompts that I've used actively in my work, is for some, these experiences can make them question why they were treated this way. I'm not trying to say that I know this is why you were treated this way, but I'm curious if you've ever thought about the why or the attribution process. Why do I feel like this has been a part of my story or my experience? And then if I feel like somebody's really kind of consented and invited me into this like identity kind of exploration part of their story, being like, is there any part of your background that you feel or that you've suspected is connected to this experience? And if they say no, then okay, I can move on. And if they say yes, then I'd be more than happy to ask permission to move further and understand a little bit more of what they feel falls in this category. Also, current events that are vicarious. So social media and media in general is constantly kind of showcasing different ways in which culture and stressors in different cultural groups are an everyday thing, and something that people are often struggling with. And so, if somebody brings something up, or if I know that something that has happened recently feels related to a part of their who am I diagram that they have communicated to me earlier in the therapeutic process, I might use a phrase like, I recently heard about this event. I'm curious if this is something that you have thoughts about or something that you would be interested in talking more about today. And if the answer to that is no, like, why are you bringing that up? I was go, oh, wait, I'm aware that some individuals are really struggling with this right now. And really, I've had some conversations about it today or this week or this month, and just wanted to give you the opportunity to discuss that if you'd like. And if the answer to that is yes, like this is something that's really, really been on my mind, and maybe then exploring that further and the impact of that. From a race standpoint, here are some self-reports that can be utilized as well. Some semi-structured interviews that should be accessible online. And last but not least, the in-session activities. One that I love that was created by some of my colleagues at Montefiore Medical Center is the mapping vulnerability and privilege. So this is more of like a drawing exercise where you have people draw their communities and the resources within their communities and have them kind of color coordinated in a color coordinated fashion, represent the resources that they do have access to and they don't, and also any sources of violence or even discrimination within that map. And then they also include some process questions to help you kind of give you some support in exploring that with your clients. And then I also have another kind of map exercise in my workbook that also helps people to map out their relationships and the spaces in their community that they spend time. And then it gives specific prompts for kind of representing not just the stresses within their map, but also the strengths as well.
How do we understand problem behavior? What we know with youth mental health is we have the DSM and we have the ICD-11. What are they? They're classification systems. So they're catalogs of mental disorders diagnosed by healthcare professionals. Why do we have them? It provides a common language for clinicians. It supports insurance reimbursement and access to services, and it promotes multidisciplinary collaboration. So this is the way youth mental health works in terms of classification systems. And the reason why we need it is it's a classification of symptoms that provides a common language. And then what we know, it's also supportive of billing of insurance. In applied behavior analysis, while that is part of what we do, and we can certainly classify the symptoms that we see and have that common language, we look at it from a functionalist approach. So behavior is a function of present and historical circumstances, right? That's what we know, behavioral history, what are the antecedents and the consequences that are going on. We look at behavior in terms of the operant, which is our unit of analysis, and we look at behavior that is learned. And we focus on the purpose or the function, not on what it looks like. So for assessment in behavioral pediatrics, we look at these functional relations individually as they're tailored to a specific child. So we look at them very much like we look at everything in applied behavior analysis. What is the function or the purpose of the behavior? If you have a child who is now demonstrating aggressive behavior, we're asking the question, we're trying to assess, we're looking at what is the function or the purpose of that behavior. What new behaviors do we want to teach? So what we know, again, is it's not enough to just reduce an aggressive behavior or any type of behavior. You want to teach a replacement behavior. You want to teach something else that will serve that function. Assess for, can we predict the occurrence of the behavior? So in a lot of ways, when you're working with a parent in a behavioral pediatric setting, you can ask them the question of that to try and get at, when is this aggressive behavior occurring? When are you seeing it, to get more at the function? And what variables decrease the likelihood of the behavioral occurrence? So when are you not going to see this behavior? So some of the assessment methods, all of the stuff that we do in our clinic is based on the evidence-based science surrounding applied behavior analysis, but also what works in behavioral pediatrics. So what our students and clinicians will do, if there is that warm handoff from a pediatrician or a primary care physician, is they'll get the history. So they'll get the history by doing a record review, by interviewing the parent. If the parent if this is something that's a school-based problem, sometimes we will be able to have the clinicians interview people in the school that could give more details. Doing observations. So observing in the home, in the school, in the actual clinic to see what's going on. And then if possible, a functional behavioral assessment, if possible and if needed. In that, we can do indirect, descriptive, or a functional analysis. So what came of that conversation was, what are these doorknob conversations that pediatricians have or family med physicians have? So what was described to us is what tends to happen is a child, a parent, a patient will come in for their appointment. The session is almost over. And at the very end, the physician is walking out the door with their hand on the doorknob, and somebody says, wait, one more thing. And that one more thing is significant. So, and there are many different reasons why this could happen. So it could be a parent saying, wait, there's one more thing. I feel like my adolescent is depressed. Wait, there's one more thing. My child with autism is no longer eating. So why are there these doorknobs conversations? You guys may be able to relate that you've done it before as well. So why do we do it? The anxiety and fear of judgment. So a client or a parent may worry about the perception that it might be a sensitive or an embarrassing detail. Maybe they took all the time in that session really trying to get the nerve to be able to bring up something that was sensitive. They may feel overwhelmed. So the intensity of the therapy session or the intensity of the medical session might be hard for clients to process and share their thoughts and feelings. So they feel this pressure of time running out, and they know maybe how hard it's going to be to get back into this primary care setting. So they didn't maybe work up the nerve to say it in that moment, but then as they were running out the door, they said it. Power dynamics and trust. So there's obviously that inherent power imbalance between a therapist and a client, which can affect a client's willingness to open up. The desire for continued engagement. So if we have a parent that may be needing some sort of support, maybe they don't want either the medical or the therapy session to end, and there is this desire to continue that engagement. Unconscious defense mechanisms. So sometimes it's just an avoidance of painful things, whether you realize you're avoiding it or not. And testing the therapist. So sometimes clients use them to gauge a therapist's reaction without having to engage in a deeper conversation. So what's the potential impact of these doorknob conversations? Clients may experience heightened anxiety or shame after disclosing this sensitive information, especially if they feel their concerns are not adequately addressed. So think about that potential impact when we're thinking about behavioral pediatrics, right? Behavioral pediatrics, you really want to be the warm handoff, whether that's from a psychologist or a medical professional, some sort of warm handoff. So when there is this doorknob conversation that could potentially occur, there's somebody there that's going to be able to follow up. Unresolved issues. So important topics may remain unexplored, potentially hindering the progress and the effectiveness. So if you do have a case where you have a medical doctor who really is on their way out the door to see another patient and something significant is brought up by a parent, you don't want that to remain unexplored, especially when the research suggests that a lot of these doorknob conversations are important. There could be a rupture in the therapeutic alliance if there is a lack of an appropriate response or follow-up. And then safety concerns. So obviously, if there's any kind of safety concern where a doorknob conversation could involve immediate threats of self-harm, abuse, suicidal ideation, you don't want to compromise the client's safety and the therapist's ability to respond effectively. So health education and prescriptive behavioral treatment based on the science, what does it look like? What does all of this look like in practice? Well, first, you want to support the caregiver. So behavioral treatment prescribed by practitioner for the caregiver. What we know is that in pediatrics and behavior analysis, the majority of the time you are supporting the behavior of the adults around the child in order to impact the quality of life of the child, in order to impact the behavior of the child. So the caregiver, not the practitioner, is the primary change agent. So there has to be that support for the caregiver. So think about when we first started this presentation and we talked about those doorknob conversations and why are parents doing that when the practitioner has their hand on the doorknob, and all of those reasons. And it could be shame, it could be a lack of support, it could be a power differential. So really having that warm handoff with a behavioral health clinician in order to be supportive at first and say, I'm sure this is tough. It must be really tough to have your child waking up 5 times in the middle of the night, or having a regression where your child's no longer eating. And we're going to figure this out. So kind of that first empathic, active listening, supporting of the caregiver. What we also know too is if we support the caregiver, the child is immersed in therapy around the clock. So if we're not going to do individual type interventions ourselves, we're going to do consultation and support the caregiver, and doing that in the right way with the right consultation skills will ensure that the child will get most of it if it's being implemented with fidelity. What are the tools we want to do to support the caregiver? We want to have health education first. So we want to make sure we're able to make clear and have any of the documents that we need to make sure that a parent understands health, understands what what are positive things, what are negative things. We want to have procedural guidance. So whatever we're asking a parent to do or a caregiver to do to support the behavior that was brought to us, whether that is teaching that behavior or reducing a behavior, we want to make sure that the procedural guidance is really clear. And telehealth-based support between appointments. And I think, especially following COVID, there has been a huge uptick in telehealth appointments in the medical community, but in behavioral pediatrics, that's also been very helpful. So you no longer need to have a parent come back in between appointments. You can provide support through telehealth, which I think when we think about people being able to access healthcare and access behavioral health, that's been a huge positive.
Impulse control and attention. So not surprisingly, we would automatically think this is ADHD, right? This kind of rapid shift in focus, instant gratification, and acting without really thinking through your actions. And that may even be rewarded in things like gaming, where, you know, you hesitate and it really costs you. But in the real world, it's much better to develop that pause button and be able to focus that attention, because having it scatter all over, I mean, that's one of the reasons why ADHD is an actual disorder. Okay. So individuals that have ADHD or maybe even autism, it's going to worsen their regulatory deficits because it's kind of eroding whatever progress is being made on those. And it can even overlap a little bit with individuals that have oppositional defiant disorder. So this kind of constant switching can be quite damaging for the overall development of that emotion regulation with those particular disorders. Sleep disruption, once again, that displacement hypothesis. So when individuals with anxiety, depression, ADHD, they tend to use that in the evening, their screens in the evening or right before bed, you get worse sleep quality and those symptoms tend to worsen. As far as other usage patterns, those with anxiety much more likely to have FOMO than what we see with other individuals. And we also see that social media with those anxiety tends to ramp up the co-rumination, you know, discussing those personal problems, and almost to be where that's part of their identity as opposed to not. Or even having cyberchondria, which is a lot of a kind of takeoff of the hypochondria, where you have an increase in health anxiety because of the things that you read. And as we all know, when we were first learning on the various disorders, it can be very dangerous to read too much when you're studying this, because you identify with it yourself and self-diagnose, even though you really don't have those disorders. With depression, what we see is this kind of unique increased or addictive use trajectory with social media, phones, video games. The more depression, suicidal behavior, and suicidal ideation tends to be seen with these increased kind of addictive use trajectories. Also, the upward social comparison that we've been talking about, that can lead to depression because, once again, you're never going to kind of measure up, and that can be quite dangerous. Problematic internet use, we see that with ADHD, and that's because it's almost the perfect environment. It's like, finally, I found the place that I fit in, where all of my little distracting kind of behaviors, except for when I'm really into something, and that's the hyper-focusing aspect of ADHD. But all of it is now a perfect fit. It's not me having to try to modify to learn in this real world, but now on this online world, oh boy, it's a perfect fit. And so I get sucked into using the internet more and more specifically, problematic social media use. So when dealing with individuals with ADHD, it's probably really helpful to ask those teenagers, you know, if they use social media, how long are they on? What type of platforms are they using? Because those can contribute to this inability to focus, acting without thinking things through. That is such a hallmark, and of course is not going to be getting better in that type of environment. Some more on the problematic internet use with ADHD, the artificial stimuli, the rapid shift in focus, this instant gratification approach, once again, kind of making it harder. And we also see, there was one study that I kind of ran across as far as stimulant prescriptions on TikTok, and always looking at these positive effects and not the potentially negative effects, which could even lead to some self-medicating on the part of somebody with ADHD, or who believe they have ADHD but don't actually have ADHD, right? As we switch to those with autism, the screen engagement, they really have an attraction to those screens. They have a lot more control over them. Now, they're more than 5 times as likely to stream shows or play games than use social media. So it's those interactions and things that they can do relatively solitaire that are going to be more appealing and can maybe even lead to that overuse. Now, that's something that could help. But once again, that's losing the nuance of quality and context of screen use. So maybe rather than limiting screen time altogether, limiting time on Instagram or Snapchat or TikTok, as opposed to blanket kind of screen bans. Okay. If you are working in schools, if you talk with teachers or if you talk with parents, these are just some ways to kind of refer teens for help and have these individual adults that are involved with these teenagers on what sort of things to look for. So, for example, mental health concerns, those who are anxious or depressed, experiencing suicidality, or even having dysregulation symptoms, they may need to go ahead and look at screen use as one of the factors contributing. Not all problems are because of screen use, right? But it certainly is a influential one, or certainly can be. So we need to kind of rule that out. Are there increases in behavioral problems, conduct problems, having troubles relating with others, more disruptive behavior disorders, short tempers, having kind of tantrums, destroying classrooms, things like that. So that aggression and inattention, has that started to escalate? Now, parents may be more aware of problematic online behavior because they would see that when they get home and the teenager won't get off. They may be engaging in more of that social comparison or negative feedback. They also may be presenting themselves in risky ways in the way that they kind of interact, or pictures that they upload that are maybe riskier ones. As far as the addictive patterns of use, we've discussed that. Like, they can't stop using even though they've tried. They get these withdrawal symptoms, being very fidgety, this tolerance and then relapsing when they have the opportunity, or just thinking about doing gaming all the time to the point where they're, sketching out plans and everything to the cost of actual lessons and real world content. And then excessive time, not just 4 hours, but 9 hours or more a day. And that can really get at it. And then finally, the decline in academic outcomes. There's just no better way of figuring out when something's wrong happening when you see these academic outcomes starting to pile up. You could also see it within attention, which is readily apparent typically in a classroom environment, but you could also see it at home. And then somatic consequences of this internet use, constantly holding your body in a particular body set that can lead to wrist, neck, or back strains, headaches, eye strains, or even poor sleep. So hopefully we've gone through quite a bit of material in our hour and a half here. And in case you're wondering, like, where did all this data come from? I have way too many references here. Several pages. So if you are interested, I would highly recommend downloading the slides for this presentation, and you can kind of see what goes into this. But we had quite a few here. Like I said, I went a little nuts. This is what happens when you use AI and you have 150 some odd articles that are available on this impact of screen use. You get a lot of sources that are actually quite good ones. So I wanted to make sure to include them all. Maybe I should have scaled back a couple of slides worth. That's who I am. And if you do need to go to get a hold of me, you can go and email me through psychedpractice.com. I don't have a presenter website, so that's why it just says presenter website. But hopefully you found this particular session useful. I think it's something that a lot of times, if you're working with adolescents, that we know is a factor, but maybe it's not as much of one that we bring up compared to some of the other things that we may bring up in a therapeutic session. And so this is just to get you a little more aware of some of the symptoms, what are some of the costs, some of the rationales behind all of this. And hopefully, if you do see these things, one of the things to do if you find out they're using it is to ask in a very open manner on how they're using it and what they're getting out of it and why they feel like they need to use it this amount. And not get accusatory, but really just listening to them. And then gradually trying to increase the self-awareness, and so that they can be a little more open maybe when it ultimately comes time to change the behaviors. But odds are they wouldn't have gotten on your radar if there hadn't been problems already kind of circling around there. And so your role is really to kind of just act on that and hopefully provide them with some good habits so that they can go into adulthood and use screens in a way that's adaptive and helpful for them. Because I don't want us to lose the idea of all the positives that also can come from.
Okay, so the question we have to ask now is, are the fidget devices appropriate for your class or for your child? Because remember, we're looking at evidence, and especially a lot of nomothetic evidence, that seems to suggest that it has little effect. But even within that nomothetic data, we noticed that there were some students who may have responded differently. And so what we want to provide here is, let's say that you are working with a child and you wonder if a fidget device may be appropriate. These are some clinical suggestions, though by no means would we say that these suggestions are supported by strong nomothetic by strong nomothetic evidence. It is possible that there are some behaviors that we simply want to interrupt. For example, skin picking or hair pulling, excoriation or trichotillomania. All of those, or both of those, refer to replacement behaviors that we want to make sure don't happen. And a fidget device may be an appropriate replacement behavior. So that would be the first thing for us to consider. The second thing for us to consider, think about the nature of the academic task. Particularly to think about the type of input the student needs to make, and think about how they generate the output. Do they need to use motor output? Do they need to write things down? Do they need to speak? And then we want to think about what is particularly the demands of the task, and what are the demands of the fidget. So if we think like passive listening, that's a form of input. Is it possible that a student can be fidgeting with something in their hands while listening? That's plausible, especially because listening only requires them to sit and potentially be doing something. Is it, the next thing we have to think about is, what if the output modality is oral versus manual? Well, a fidget device may very well interfere with writing, and that may be particularly difficult. So is the output modality oral or is it writing? And if it's writing, a fidget device may be inappropriate. Or if it's anything else that requires hands, like any science experiment, any kind of digging, any kind of PE activity, it's possible that the fidget can provide a direct interference with that. We also need to ask the question of upper body versus lower body fidget. If we are walking, is it possible that we could be using our hands for something? Maybe. Would it be distracting? Possibly. But someone could potentially walk and still be fidgeting, but someone can't be writing and fidgeting. So we think upper body, lower body. It's possible that somebody can sit and play with an exercise band while at the same time be writing or using their hands. That is plausible. So think about the direct kind of motor interference that the fidget device provides if deciding that a fidget device is appropriate.
Before we get into kind of the cognitive tests themselves, I want to bring up just a few things. One of the questions that I think Michael and I have heard a million times is, well, the person has a 73 IQ. They can't be considered intellectual as having an intellectual disability. And, there are some states that have tried to put these hard lines in place. And, what we have to realize is that beyond what we see in kind of some of our state laws, these have been challenged, and not only challenged in things like due process cases, but challenged to clear up through the Supreme Court. And there's a few cases that I just have listed here. Now, many of these do involve adults, and they involve the fact of these are maybe individuals who never were identified as having an intellectual disability, then as an adult had a criminal charge against them, and then there was question to their ability to stand trial. And then later in life, a disability was determined. And many of these, or actually all of these, challenge the idea that there's a rigid IQ that we should look at. The one that's probably the most famous is the one that would be on the right of your screen. That's the Freddie Hall case versus Florida, because that really got a lot of kind of publicity when it was happening. And the Supreme Court has a very detailed review, and there's been a lot of amicus briefs written about this from APA and some other organizations. I'd suggest reading it. It's actually quite interesting to read for a legal case. But what it was determined, and not a unanimous Supreme Court decision, but a majority decision that said, no, when we look at things like intellectual disability, our tests cannot be looked at as that accurate. And we must look at things like standard error of measurement. So someone with an IQ of 70, based on all other factors, should have the opportunity to be considered as having an intellectual disability, and that we can't cut it off at that. And that was a case of, in this situation, a potential death sentence case that they overturned. So something to just kind of consider as you're doing your. So when we talk about what tests to use, and then I'm going to let Michael kind of go through kind of the score aspect here. But there are a lot of tests that we can pull from, and there's no perfect test. I see people all the time say, "Oh, what's your protocol for intellectual disabilities?" I don't know if I have a protocol. I think I pick the test that might be the best for the situation with a certain person. So maybe sometimes I might think about a nonverbal test, but that's not my go-to in these cases. And usually there's really kind of rare circumstances. Sometimes I think the WISC is a better test. Other times I might use the RIOS. It really does depend on the situation. We know certain tests have better norms for more severe ID, specifically the DOS-2. And although it's old, the Stanford-Binet, they do have extended norms that are not statistically compressed. So most of our tests, lowest score you can get is 40, and that you can't go beyond that for severe cases. And that's because of the way statistical compaction is put into play with test development. However, some of these tests have those extensions, the DOS-2 and Stanford-Binet being two examples. So if you're working with populations that do have more severe difficulties, those are two tools that we can look at. I'm going to turn it over to Michael to talk a little bit about specific tests and how we look at some of the scores.
Number one, we need to be cautious, right? And I know that something that Ray and I have both encountered when we encounter questions on social media, or when I'm teaching a graduate class and I get questions from students, or I'm consulting with people in schools, is the idea that I feel icky about, say, identifying a student with a full scale of 73 and verbal comprehension scores of 75 and some really clear strengths. I feel icky about identifying them as intellectually disabled. I want to be really careful with that diagnosis. We absolutely should be careful with that diagnosis. That is not a term we want to throw around carelessly, right? But caution doesn't mean adopting more rigid criteria than are written into the law, right? Caution means doing a very comprehensive, careful evaluation and working very deliberately to collect the best information we can and then applying it to the criteria that actually do exist with fidelity, right? So sometimes we see arbitrary cutoffs as cautious. Well, if they're not at 70 or below, I'm not going to call them intellectually disabled. I would suggest that's actually lazy thinking, right? Caution really means doing a deep dive and collecting all the right data and then really understanding the properties of the tests, which we'll go into in a minute, as well as the definition of ID that we're working off of. I would also suggest that we always need to approach this, and Ray has mentioned this already, but I'll echo what he's saying, with an acknowledgement that individuals with intellectual disabilities show tremendous potential for growth, and that should be a focus of our evaluation, right? So our adaptive behavior assessments, if they uncover, say, really significant strengths in personal domestic skills, like the youth that Ray talked about before, who could make 200 rounds of pizza dough a day. That doesn't mean he's not intellectually disabled, but that also doesn't mean that we ignore that, right? We use that as a jumping off point for services and for supports, and we celebrate that strength. And we also acknowledge that if we do identify an individual with intellectual disabilities, and we do what we're supposed to do, which is get them really good teaching and intervention, we are going to see growth, right? So 3 years from now, we shouldn't assume that everything is stable. You know, when we're doing our reevaluations, we should hopefully see areas of tremendous growth, which is expected in individuals with intellectual disabilities. You know, we should expect it and we should celebrate it. So when we're talking about the tests that we use,